Today we will explore how the inhabitants of medieval Europe faced one of the greatest threats to their survival: the long and implacable winters that tested the limits of human endurance. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one, and don't forget to leave your comment at the end. There was an old medieval proverb that said, "Winter devours what summer makes grow." These simple words carried a brutal truth that echoed through every village, castle, and monastery in Europe. For the men and women living at that time, winter was not just a season, it was a period of trial. The days shortened, temperatures plummeted, and the once green fields transformed into desolate landscapes covered in snow and ice. Survival depended entirely on the ability to prepare during the milder months. Medieval Europe experienced distinct climatic periods that profoundly shaped the lives of its inhabitants. Between approximately the years 750 and 1350, the continent experienced the so-called medieval warm period, an era of exceptionally mild temperatures that allowed for agricultural expansion and even the cultivation of grapes in regions of England and northern Germany. These favorable conditions brought prosperity and population growth. However, as with all things, this bounty would not last forever. Around the year 1300, something began to change. Temperatures began a gradual decline that would mark the beginning of a new climatic era. Chroniclers of the time had no name for this phenomenon, but modern historians would call it the Little Ice Age, a period that would span approximately 4 centuries. In the first years of this transition, the signs were already evident. Winters became harsher, springs arrived later, and summers seemed increasingly shorter. The intensity of these winters left deep marks on history. In 1303, the Baltic Sea froze over completely, an event that would repeat in 1306 and 1307. Ships became trapped in the ice, and coastal communities found themselves isolated. During the winter of 1363 to 1364, long stretches of the Rhine River remained frozen for consecutive months. Even the southern regions did not escape the winter's fury. The Po River in Italy froze so solidly in the winter of 1216 that the inhabitants organized a jousting tournament on its surface. In February 1352, Florence remained covered in snow for the entire month, and the snow accumulated in such a way that residents were trapped in their homes for days. Faced with such conditions, preparation became a matter of life or death. Medieval popular wisdom taught that he who did not prepare during the months of abundance would surely suffer during the months of scarcity. And so, from the spring, each family began a long process of accumulating and preserving resources. Wheat and barley were carefully stored in barns, specially prepared to protect the grains from moisture and rodents. A common technique consisted of lining the floor of the barn with gorse branches or other thorny plants, elevating the grains from the damp ground, and making access difficult for rats and mice. The grains preserved during the summer would be the basis of the winter diet. From them came bread, when the mills were functioning, and porridges, when the frozen waters made the grinding of flour impossible. Among these porridges, one dish stood out for its omnipresence and versatility. It was known as frumenti, a word derived from the Latin frumentum, which simply means grain. This wheat porridge, simple in its essence, fed entire generations of Europeans, from the humblest serfs to kings at their banquets. Frumenti in its most basic form consisted of wheat grains boiled in water until soft, then mixed with milk and thickened with egg yolks. The result was a thick, nutritious and comforting preparation capable of warming the body and providing energy to face the freezing days. For the peasants, this simple version was often all they had at their disposal. For them, the porridge did not need to be beautiful or tasty. It only needed to satiate hunger and keep the body warm. On the wealthier tables, however, frumenti gained an air of sophistication. Spices imported from distant lands were added to the dish, transforming the humble porridge into a delicacy worthy of banquets. Saffron provided a vibrant golden color, cinnamon added an enveloping aroma, and sugar softened the flavor of the grains. Some more elaborate recipes called for frumenti to be served with venison broth or even as an accompaniment to dolphin meat, an ingredient reserved only for royalty. In the English recipe book, The Form of Cury, dated to approximately 1390, one finds a recipe that suggests serving frumenty with porpoise, considered a fish by the church and therefore permitted during fast days. The origin of frumenty dates back to even more ancient times. The Romans already knew a similar preparation called pulse, a grain porridge consumed by the soldiers of the legions. The Benedictine monks of the early Middle Ages refined the dish, adapting it to the rules of frugality of their monasteries. For these religious figures, frumenty represented sustenance and simplicity. One of the oldest recipe books in the French language, Le Viandier de Taillevent, written around the year 1300, presents detailed instructions for its preparation. The recipe instructed to take the wheat, wash it well and cook it in water. When it was cooked, it should be drained, and then one would take cow's milk, bring it to a boil, add the wheat and boil it again. Beaten egg yolks were added at the end. Some people added spices and venison broth. But frumenty was only one part of the complex winter survival system. The preservation of meats constituted another fundamental pillar. During the summer and autumn, animals were fattened for slaughter. Abundant pastures and harvest leftovers provided plenty of food for pigs, oxen, sheep, and goats. However, maintaining these animals during the winter would be economically unfeasible, as each animal represented one more mouth to feed with the precious grain stocks. The Festival of Martinmas, celebrated on November 11th, traditionally marked the beginning of the slaughter season. On this date, rural communities across medieval Europe carried out the mass slaughter of their herds. Only breeding animals and dairy cows were spared, reserved to ensure the continuity of the herds in the following spring. The rest were sacrificed, and the race to preserve the meat began immediately. Salt was the primary preservation agent. Families immersed the meat in concentrated brines or covered it completely with coarse salt, removing the moisture that would allow for the growth of bacteria. This technique, although effective, had notable consequences for the palate. Salted meat was extremely hard and, as the name suggests, very salty. To make it palatable, it was necessary to boil it for hours before consumption, a process that softened the fibers and extracted part of the excess salt. In addition to salting, smoking offered another preservation option. Sausages and other cured meats were hung over smoky fires, often in the very beams of the houses. Medieval constructions mostly did not yet have proper chimneys. The smoke from the hearths rose freely to the roof, escaping through openings in the tiles or through the thatch. This smoky environment, though uncomfortable for the residents, was perfect for curing meats hanging from the upper beams. Nothing was wasted. The internal organs of the animals were transformed into preserves. The blood gave rise to black puddings and blood sausages, which, kept in cool places, could last for months. The intestines were cleaned and used as casings for sausages. Even the fat was carefully preserved, as it would serve both for cooking and for waterproofing fabrics and leather. Pigs and geese received special treatment. While most animals were slaughtered in November, these two were spared until December. The reason was simple and pragmatic. In the autumn, pigs and geese could feed freely on acorns, worms, and other foods found in the forests and fields without needing to consume grain stocks. Allowing them to feed for one more month meant fatter animals and more meat to preserve. For this reason, December became traditionally associated with the slaughter of pigs, an iconography that appears in numerous illustrated medieval calendars. Pork was particularly important for the humblest families. Oxen were expensive animals, accessible only to the wealthiest. Pigs, on the other hand, could be raised by almost any family. These omnivorous animals fed on practically everything, from food scraps to roots and insects. Their ability to transform practically any organic matter into nutritious meat made them indispensable allies in the struggle for survival. And what about fish, one might ask? Certainly the rivers and lakes offered an alternative source of food. The reality, however, was quite different for most peasants. In the feudal system that dominated medieval Europe, practically all lands belonged to some lord, and with the lands also came the rights over the rivers, lakes, and streams that crossed them. Fishing, therefore, was a privilege reserved for the nobles and those to whom they granted permission. The vast majority of feudal lords denied this right to their serfs. For those living near the sea, the prospects were a bit better, as the ocean was considered a common resource. However, fishing in the open sea during the winter was extremely dangerous. Still, fish found its way to medieval tables. Herring was salted or pickled for distribution across the continent, but the true champion of preservation was dried cod, known as stockfish. This fish went through a process of drying and fermentation that made it incredibly durable, able to last for years without spoiling. The durability of stockfish, however, came with a price. The fish became so hard and dried out that it literally needed to be beaten with a hammer before being cooked. Even after this treatment, hours of boiling were necessary to make it minimally edible. The resulting texture was described in unappetizing ways by contemporaries themselves. In the Book of Marjorie Kempe, a work from the early 15th century, the author recounts a vision in which Jesus tells her that she would be gnawed by the people of the world just as a rat gnaws stockfish, and that she would cling to him as firmly as the skin of stockfish sticks to a man's hands when it is boiled. Lent, the 40-day period of abstinence preceding Easter, which fell predominantly during the winter, brought additional challenges. During this time, the Church forbade the consumption of meat, eggs, and dairy. For the rich, this restriction simply meant replacing meat with expensive fish and elaborate preparations. For the poor, however, Lent could be a period of true scarcity. Meat reserves were generally already low when Lent began, but losing access to milk, butter, and eggs as well represented a hard blow to the already limited winter diet. The solution found was the use of almond or hazelnut milk. These plant-based milks replaced cow's milk in practically all preparations. Frumenti, prepared during Lent, used almond milk and was served without egg yolks. In addition to grains and preserved meats, some fresh foods managed to survive the colder months. Apples and pears, harvested in the autumn and stored in cool, dry places, often lasted until February. Cabbages and leeks were grown and harvested, even during the snowiest months, their hardy leaves withstanding temperatures that would destroy other vegetables. Radishes also occupied a special place in the medieval winter diet. The medicine of the time was still based on the theory of the four humours, which classified all things as combinations of hot, cold, moist, and dry. Winter was considered a cold and moist season, and therefore harmful to the body's balance. To combat these effects, the consumption of foods considered hot and dry was recommended. Radishes fit perfectly into this category. A 13th century scholar known as Bartholomew the Englishman wrote that heat burns in the fatty matter of the radish root, and that in winter it is a reservoir of heat that multiplies. Nuts also played a crucial role in winter nutrition. Chestnuts, walnuts, almonds, and hazelnuts were harvested in the autumn and stored for consumption throughout the winter. During Lent, when so many other foods were forbidden, nuts became even more important, providing essential fats and proteins that would otherwise be absent from the diet. Keeping the body fed was only half the battle. Keeping warm represented the other half. Castles and manor houses had enormous fireplaces in practically every room, consuming impressive amounts of firewood. The tapestries that decorated the walls were not just aesthetic elements, but also functioned as insulation, retaining heat within the rooms. The clothing of the nobility included layers of thick wool lined with animal furs, creating a cocoon of warmth around their privileged bodies. For the peasants, however, the situation was very different. Their houses were simple constructions, often with wattle and daub walls and thatched roofs that let precious heat escape. A single hearth in the center of the building was all they had to warm the entire family. Clothes were made of coarse wool, efficient at retaining heat, but far from the comfort of the furs used by the nobility. Sumptuary laws enacted in various European kingdoms made this inequality even more pronounced. In England in 1363, rules were established determining which fabrics and furs each social class could wear. Even if a prosperous merchant could financially afford fine fur clothing, the laws forbade him from wearing them. These restrictions were not based only on social prestige, but had practical consequences during harsh winters. While a noble wrapped in ermine furs remained comfortably warm, a peasant in his simple wool clothes shivered with cold. Communities developed collective strategies to face the cold. The sharing of spaces and even beds became common practice. Travelers in inns often shared the same bed with complete strangers, a practical necessity that transcended any modesty. In some regions of France and Russia, entire families hibernated together, remaining in bed for weeks, rising only for the most essential tasks. In French alpine villages, families slept together with their animals, taking advantage of the body heat of cows and sheep to survive the coldest nights. Extreme cold affected not only human comfort, but also the food distribution chain itself. When the rivers froze, water mills stopped working, making it impossible to grind flour for bread. Without flour, communities were forced to resort to alternatives like frumenti, which used whole cooked grains instead of ground ones. Boats that normally transported goods along the rivers were immobilized, isolating communities that depended on this river trade. An Italian chronicler recorded that during the winter, in which the Po River froze, the cold was so intense that bread, apples, pears, and all types of food froze solid, unable to be cut or eaten until they were heated and thawed by the fire. Even wine froze inside the barrels, and to extract it, it was necessary to use axes to break the solid block into which it had transformed. Food prices reflected these difficulties. With the exception of a few government-controlled items, such as beer and bread, all other foods had their prices raised during the winter months. In 1340s England, the cost of stabling and feeding a horse for one night at an inn cost about a penny and a half during the summer, but rose to 3.5 pennies during the winter. This increase reflected not only the scarcity of food, but also the higher costs of heating and maintenance during the cold months. Paradoxically, while prices rose, wages fell. The shorter days of winter meant fewer working hours, and workers were paid proportionally less. A tilemaker in London in the 1340s earned 5.5 pennies a day during the summer, but only 4.5 pennies during the winter. This combination of higher prices and lower wages could result in an urban worker spending more than 70% of his income just on food during the coldest months. Bartholomew the Englishman captured this reality in a passage that, although it originally referred to plants, applied equally to the finances of common families. He wrote that all things that lived and grew by the benefit of summer withered and died by the rigorous cruelty of winter. For many families, the savings accumulated during the productive months simply evaporated when the cold arrived. This was the reality that made a simple wheat porridge so precious. Frumenti was not just food, it was a line of defense against hunger and cold. Its preparation was simple enough to be executed by any family, and its basic ingredients, wheat, milk, and eggs, were within the reach of most. For those who did not have access to spices or sugar, the basic porridge still offered sustenance. For the more fortunate, the additions of saffron, cinnamon, and other condiments transformed the humble preparation into a dish worthy of celebration. The thickness of the frumenti was particularly important. Medieval recipes emphasized that the porridge should be very thick, a characteristic that was not merely aesthetic. A thick porridge remained longer in the stomach, prolonging the feeling of satiety and providing energy for more hours. In a context where meals could be scarce, each dish needed to yield as much as possible. The cooked wheat grains maintained their individual texture, unlike an oatmeal porridge that turns into a homogeneous mass. Each grain burst in the mouth when chewed, offering a sensory experience that contemporaries clearly appreciated. Egg yolks provided a creamy richness to the dish, in addition to contributing protein and extra fats. The result was a food that truly stuck to the ribs, as popular wisdom would say. The yellowish color of the dish, mentioned in the recipes, was not a decorative whim. In a society that associated bright colors with quality foods, the golden appearance of frumenti signaled nutrition and value. Saffron, when available, intensified this yellow, but even the egg yolks already gave a pleasant hue to the porridge. The peasants, pragmatic in their approach to survival, probably did not worry much about the color of their food. For them, it mattered that the dish warmed their bodies and kept hunger away until the next meal. Medieval monasteries played a crucial role in the preservation and dissemination of recipes like frumenti. Monks created some of the oldest recipe books that have survived to our day. Their kitchens served not only the religious communities, but also travelers seeking shelter during the winter. The transition from the medieval warm period to the Little Ice Age was not abrupt, but its cumulative effects were devastating. Harvests began to fail more frequently. Famines became more common and more severe. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 killed millions of people across Europe, a sinister prelude to the difficulties that would come. The following decades would bring not only cold and hunger, but also the Black Death, which found a population already weakened by malnutrition and climatic stress. Still, human resilience prevailed. Food preservation techniques were refined over the centuries. Communities developed mutual support systems that allowed for collective survival even when individuals faced difficulties. Simple dishes like frumenti became symbols of resistance, foods that connected generations through the shared experience of facing and overcoming the rigors of winter. The medieval recipes that survive today tell stories of entire civilizations struggling against the forces of nature. Each instruction for cooking grains carries echoes of winters passed centuries ago. The Little Ice Age eventually gave way to milder climatic conditions. Preservation techniques evolved with the development of modern science. However, the memory of those difficult times remained inscribed in European culture, manifesting in culinary traditions and popular proverbs. Frumenti never completely disappeared. In some regions of England, versions of the dish continued to be prepared until the 20th century. Food historians and enthusiasts have rediscovered the recipe, preparing it at historical reenactment festivals. The history of winter survival in medieval Europe teaches us lessons that transcend its specific historical context. The importance of advanced preparation, the necessity of making the most of available resources, the value of community cooperation, and the human capacity to adapt to adverse circumstances are principles as relevant today as they were 7 centuries ago. The men and women who faced those implacable winters did not have access to the technologies we consider basic today. What they had was knowledge accumulated through generations, passed down from parents to children. This knowledge was their greatest treasure. And so, when we think of frumenti, we should not see it only as an antiquated dish from a distant era. We should recognize in it a symbol of human ingenuity, of the capacity to transform simple ingredients into vital sustenance. Each grain of wheat cooked in that thick porridge represents a victory against scarcity. Each bowl consumed by the warmth of a flickering hearth represents a family that survived to see the spring. The medieval proverb was right: winter truly devours what summer makes grow. But those who knew how to prepare themselves, who mastered the art of preserving and conserving, who shared their resources and knowledge with their communities, those found ways to cross the darkest months. And when spring finally arrived, bringing with it longer days and milder temperatures, they emerged ready to plant, raise, and accumulate again, perpetuating the cycle that sustained European civilization through centuries of climatic challenges. History continues to be written. The climate changes we face today present new challenges, different from those of the past, but equally serious. Perhaps there are lessons to be learned from our medieval ancestors, not in their specific techniques, but in their attitude of respect before natural forces and in their determination to adapt and survive. Frumenti may seem like a dish too simple to carry such meaning, but it is precisely in its simplicity that its strength resides. It reminds us that in the end, survival has always depended on the human capacity to do much with little. If this journey through the medieval past has awakened your curiosity and you wish to continue exploring fascinating stories like this one, consider subscribing to our channel. Each subscription helps us produce more content that connects the present to the past, revealing the stories that shaped our world. Leave your comment sharing what you thought of this narrative, what themes you would like to see explored in the future, or simply your reflections on how our ancestors faced challenges that today we can barely imagine. Your participation is the fuel that keeps this project alive, just as frumenti kept generations of Europeans alive during the harshest winters in history. Until the next documentary narrative.